In the depths of our psychological landscape lies one of the most complex and misunderstood archetypes that Carl Jung ever explored, the shadow side of the mother. If you're ready to dive deep into the darker territories of the maternal psyche and discover how this profound archetype shapes our lives in ways we never imagined, then make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay with me for the entire journey, because what we're about to uncover will fundamentally change how you understand not just motherhood, but the very foundations of human psychology itself. Carl Gustav Jung, the pioneering Swiss psychiatrist who gave us concepts like the collective unconscious and psychological types, spent decades studying the archetypal patterns that govern human behavior, and among all his discoveries, perhaps none is more crucial yet more carefully avoided in our culture than understanding the shadow aspects of the maternal archetype. When we speak of the mother in Jungian psychology, we're not merely discussing the biological mother or even the personal mother figure in our individual lives, but rather the primordial pattern embedded deep within our collective unconscious, an archetype that carries both the nurturing, life-giving qualities we celebrate and the destructive, devouring aspects we desperately try to ignore. The shadow side of the mother represents those darker maternal impulses and behaviors that our society prefers to keep hidden beneath layers of idealization and sentimentality. Yet, these shadow aspects are not aberrations or pathologies, but rather integral components of the complete maternal archetype that Jung understood to be essential for psychological wholeness and development. To truly grasp the shadow side of the mother, we must first understand Jung's revolutionary concept of the shadow itself, which he described as the hidden, repressed, or denied aspects of the personality that we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, the parts of our nature that we find unacceptable and therefore project onto others or bury in our unconscious minds. The shadow is not inherently evil or negative, but rather represents the unlived potentials within us, the aspects of our personality that have been deemed inappropriate by our conscious ego or by society at large. And when it comes to the maternal archetype, the shadow contains all those aspects of motherhood that contradict our collective fantasy of the perfect, selfless, endlessly giving mother. Jung observed that every archetype contains its opposite, its shadow counterpart, and the mother archetype is no exception to this fundamental law of the psyche. While the positive mother archetype embodies nurturing, protection, unconditional love, fertility, and the life-giving principle itself, the shadow mother carries within her the seeds of destruction, possessiveness, manipulation, emotional vampirism, and what Jung termed the devouring mother complex that can literally consume the psychological life of her children. This shadow mother is not simply a bad mother in the conventional sense, but rather represents the natural and inevitable dark side of maternal power that emerges when the nurturing instinct becomes twisted, excessive, or misdirected, creating patterns of behavior that ultimately harm rather than help those who fall under her influence. The devouring mother, one of Jung's most significant contributions to our understanding of maternal psychology, represents the mother who loves too much, who cannot allow her children to separate and individuate, who treats her offspring as extensions of herself rather than as autonomous beings with their own destinies to fulfill. This archetype manifests when the mother's own unlived waif, her own unfulfilled dreams and aspirations, become projected onto her children, turning them into vessels for her vicarious achievement and emotional satisfaction, rather than supporting their natural development toward independence and self-realization. The devouring mother may appear outwardly loving and devoted. Indeed, she often prides herself on her sacrifices and dedication, but beneath this apparent devotion lies a possessive love that seeks to bind rather than liberate, to control rather than empower, to keep her children dependent upon her for their emotional and psychological survival. Jung understood that this pattern emerges not from malice or conscious ill intent, but from the mother's own psychological wounding, her own relationship with the maternal archetype, and her inability to differentiate between genuine love and possessive attachment. The shadow mother also manifests through what Jung identified as emotional manipulation, where the mother uses guilt, martyrdom, and emotional blackmail to maintain control over her children's lives and choices. This type of shadow mother presents herself as the long-suffering victim, the woman who has sacrificed everything for her children and therefore deserves their eternal gratitude and obedience, creating a psychological prison where the children feel perpetually indebted and unable to pursue their own paths without feeling guilty or selfish. She may use phrases like, "after all I've done for you," or "you're breaking my heart," whenever her children attempt to assert their independence or make choices that don't align with her expectations, effectively weaponizing her maternal role to maintain psychological control long after her children have reached physical maturity. Another crucial aspect of the shadow mother that Jung explored is the phenomenon of emotional incest. Not physical incest, but rather the inappropriate emotional relationship where the mother treats her child, particularly sons, as emotional partners or confidants, rather than maintaining appropriate generational boundaries. This shadow mother may share intimate details about her marriage, her disappointments, her fears and resentments, burdening her children with adult concerns and emotional responsibilities that are far beyond their developmental capacity to handle, creating what Jung called a psychological marriage between mother and child that prevents healthy romantic relationships from developing later in life. The child who has been emotionally married to his mother finds it nearly impossible to commit fully to a romantic partner because no one can compete with the intensity and primacy of that original emotional bond. And the mother, whether consciously or unconsciously, often works to sabotage her child's romantic relationships to maintain her position as the primary emotional figure in his life. Jung identified the critical and rejecting shadow mother, the woman who cannot provide the emotional warmth and acceptance that children need for healthy development, often because she herself was never properly mothered and therefore lacks the internal template for nurturing behavior. The shadow mother may be physically present but emotionally absent, providing the basic necessities of life while withholding the emotional nourishment that allows children to develop a secure sense of self-worth and trust in relationships. She may be highly critical, never satisfied with her children's achievements, always pointing out flaws and failures, creating children who grow up feeling fundamentally inadequate and unworthy of love unless they can prove their value through perfect performance or endless achievement. This type of shadow mother often produces children who become perfectionist workaholics, people pleasers, or individuals with deep-seated feelings of shame and inadequacy that persist throughout their adult lives. The narcissistic shadow mother represents another significant pattern that Jung observed. Though he didn't use the modern terminology of narcissistic personality disorder, he clearly understood the dynamics of the mother who cannot see her children as separate beings with their own needs, feelings, and destinies, but instead views them primarily as reflections of herself or as objects to be molded according to her own image and desires. This shadow mother may be charming and seemingly loving to the outside world, but her love is conditional upon her children conforming to her expectations and reflecting well upon her as a mother. And any deviation from her prescribed path is met with withdrawal of affection, criticism, or emotional punishment. Children of narcissistic shadow mothers often struggle throughout their lives to develop a clear sense of their own identity because they were never allowed to be themselves in childhood, instead being forced to become whatever version of themselves their mother could accept and approve of. Jung's exploration of the shadow mother also revealed the phenomenon of the martyred mother, the woman who makes her suffering and sacrifice the central organizing principle of family life, teaching her children that love equals suffering and that they are responsible for her emotional well-being and happiness. The shadow mother may constantly remind her children of her pain during childbirth, her sleepless nights caring for them, her financial sacrifices, her social isolation, creating a family mythology where the children's very existence is a burden that the mother nobly bears, and therefore the children owe her their lives, their choices, their freedom, and their happiness in return. This pattern creates children who feel guilty for existing, who believe that their needs are burdens, and who often spend their adult lives trying to compensate their mothers for the supposed damage their birth and childhood caused, never able to feel that they have given enough or done enough to balance the scales of maternal sacrifice. The obstinate or abandoning shadow mother represents the other extreme, the woman who physically or emotionally abandons her children, either through death, divorce, addiction, mental illness, or simply emotional availability, leaving her children to grapple with feelings of abandonment, unworthiness, and the fundamental question of why they weren't worth staying for or fighting for. Jung understood that this type of shadow mother experience often creates children who either become extremely independent and self-reliant to the point of being unable to trust or depend on others, or conversely become desperately clingy and dependent, always seeking the maternal love they never received, and never able to feel secure in relationships because of the primal wound of maternal abandonment. The projection of the shadow mother onto other women is another crucial aspect of Jung's understanding of this archetype, as individuals who have experienced difficult relationships with their personal mothers often unconsciously project these patterns onto wives, girlfriends, daughters, female bosses, or other women in positions of authority or intimacy, creating repetitive patterns of conflict and disappointment that seem to follow them throughout their lives. Men who have unresolved issues with the shadow mother may find themselves repeatedly attracted to women who embody similar problematic patterns, or conversely, they may become so fearful of feminine power that they avoid deep relationships altogether or seek to control and dominate the women in their lives as a defense against their own
feelings of vulnerability and powerlessness. Women who have experienced the shadow mother may find themselves either unconsciously repeating similar patterns with their own children or going to the opposite extreme and being unable to set appropriate boundaries or provide necessary structure because they're so afraid of becoming like their own mothers. Jung emphasized that the shadow mother is not simply a personal phenomenon, but also a cultural and collective one, manifesting in societies that either idealize motherhood to an unrealistic degree, making it impossible for real mothers to live up to impossible standards, or that devalue and marginalize mothers, failing to provide the support and resources that women need to fulfill their maternal roles in healthy ways. Our contemporary culture's conflicted relationship with motherhood, where mothers are simultaneously expected to be perfectly selfless and endlessly available, while also being professionally successful, sexually attractive, and individually fulfilled, creates a collective shadow around motherhood that makes it difficult for individual women to integrate the full complexity of the maternal archetype in their own lives. The healing of the shadow mother begins with recognition and acknowledgement, with the courage to look honestly at the ways the maternal archetype has been distorted or corrupted in our personal and collective experience, without falling into either extreme of demonizing mothers or idealizing them beyond recognition. Jung believed that true psychological healing required what he called the integration of opposites, the ability to hold both the light and dark aspects of any archetype in conscious awareness, neither rejecting the shadow nor being overwhelmed by it, but finding a way to honor the full spectrum of human experience, including its most difficult and painful aspects. For individuals who have experienced the shadow mother, this integration process often involves grieving the mother they never had, while simultaneously taking responsibility for their own healing and growth, recognizing that while their early experiences may have shaped them, they are not doomed to repeat these patterns forever, but can choose to break the cycle and create new possibilities for themselves and future generations. The path of healing also requires developing what Jung called the inner good mother, the internalized capacity for self-nurturing, self-compassion, and appropriate self-care that may have been missing from their early experience, learning to provide for themselves the kind of unconditional love and acceptance that every human being needs to thrive psychologically and emotionally. This doesn't mean becoming self-indulgent or narcissistic, but rather developing a mature and balanced relationship with their own needs and feelings, learning to trust their own perceptions and instincts, and creating the internal security and stability that allows them to form healthy relationships with others without being driven by unconscious patterns of neediness, control, or fear. For those who are mothers themselves, integrating the shadow mother archetype means acknowledging their own potential for destructive maternal behaviors, while simultaneously committing to conscious parenting practices that support their children's healthy development and individuation. Recognizing that perfect motherhood is an impossible and ultimately harmful goal, but that good enough mothering, as Jung's contemporary Donald Winnicott called it, is both achievable and sufficient for raising psychologically healthy children. This requires ongoing self-reflection, willingness to apologize and make amends when they make mistakes, commitment to their own personal growth and healing work, and the humility to recognize that their children are separate beings with their own paths to walk rather than extensions of themselves or vessels for their own unlived dreams and ambitions. Understanding the shadow side of the mother ultimately leads us to a more complete and realistic appreciation of the maternal archetype as a whole, recognizing that the capacity for both nurturing and destruction exists within every mother and every person who carries maternal energy in their lives, and that true wisdom lies not in denying or rejecting these shadow aspects, but in bringing them into conscious awareness, where they can be acknowledged, understood, and integrated in service of greater wholeness and authenticity. Jung's exploration of the shadow mother reminds us that the path to psychological maturity requires facing the difficult truths about our most cherished relationships and archetypal patterns, and that only by honestly confronting these shadow aspects can be hoped to transform them from unconscious sources of suffering into conscious tools for growth, healing, and the creation of more authentic and loving relationships in our own lives and in the lives of future generations.